Hi, Misha here, and in our next episode of Cat Wings, I think we all now feel the need for speed. We just got through with the E2 Hawkeye, which was not speedy, and so now let's get to the F-14 Tomcat. And what better cat to endorse the Tomcat than Oscar, the bobcat of the house. Very, very masculine and frightening, aren't you, Oscar? Yeah. So let's get into the highway to the danger zone here. The F-14 really came about thanks to the F-111, specifically the F-111B, the Navy version, and its outright failure. Well, Grumman's previous F-11 Tiger was less than successful. It's not that it was a horrible plane, it's just that the competition from Vought was in every way superior. So if they were going to regain ascendancy, they had to come to the table with something really quite good. In 1966, the Navy kind of gave them the go-ahead to look into developing a new, advanced, modern, Mach 2 capable fighter interceptor for fleet defense. Now, at this time, the Navy was still pursuing the F-111B, not so much because it wanted it, but because the powers that be, politics, were more or less forcing it upon them. The idea was for the Air Force to have the 111A and for the Navy to have the 111B. Well, Grumman had an internal project. In 1967, they showed it to the Navy. This was called the Model 303 or the G303. And the Navy was duly impressed with their progress, what they'd come up with. It's worth noting that Grumman had assisted in the development of the F-111B, specifically making it carrier friendly because they had a lot of experience with it. But the Navy liked the 303 and told them to kind of keep working. Finally, in 1968, in April, the Navy brass had enough of what would become the aardvark, and they convinced Congress to essentially pull funding for it in April of that year. Then in July, they let out requirements for the VFX, Advanced Fighter Experimental Program. And what they wanted a Mach 2 capable, two-seater, essentially a pilot and a weapons officer. They wanted it to be two-engine. It needed to have better range and endurance than the current F-4 Phantom. And basically it would incorporate a lot of lessons learned from combat in Vietnam. Chief among them, it needed a cannon again. The F-4 did not have a cannon, and that was quickly decided that was not a great idea. So by December of that year, essentially there were two finalists. We had Grumman and we had McDonnell Douglas. And then in early 1969, the winner was Grumman, and they were given the go-ahead to continue developing the 303 project. And honestly, By 1970, what we have here, the F-14 was essentially ready for its first test flight. The whole development was only 22 months. Very impressive, all things considered. They actually didn't do prototypes. They didn't want to go through all of that. They were tired of the politicking and the Vietnam War and just everything, so they just essentially put it straight into development and then pre-production. By 1973, it was ready to go, and it started to see fleet service in 1974, and by September that year, it started to replace F-4 Phantoms throughout the Navy. So what did Grumman come up with? Well, the original F-14A, this here, was over 62 feet long. It had variable geometry, or swing wings. Quite a wide sweep to them, out to 68 degrees. The idea, when it was intercepting and trying to go at high speeds, they'd be all the way back. When it was landing, taking off, they would be forward, and they would be adjusted and controlled by a computer. However, the pilot still had the option to manually override if necessary. This was considered a fourth-generation fighter, so computers, fly-by-wire, and kind of the emphasis on the fighter were all emblematic of that era. We have two crew members, a pilot and a Rio. This was capable of going over Mach 2.3, over 1,500 miles per hour. It had a ceiling of about 50,000 feet. It was equipped with 120mm cannon with 675 rounds. It had a total of 10 hard points. Unlike the Aardvark, the actual parts of the wings that moved did not have hard points. Instead, they were all under the fuselage on the wing roots, wing gloves. And when this went into service, it was the largest, heaviest carrier-based fighter. To be fair, it was a little smaller than the F-111B would have been, because the Aardvark was a very big plane. But since that never went into service, this kind of got that mantle. Speaking of the Aardvark, though this was a two-engine design, it originally was set up to use the TF-30 engines of the Aardvark. Although this was always expected to be replaced, it just took longer than I think anyone anticipated. Unfortunately, because these engines ended up being a kind of a limiting factor of the plane. Now, initially, it was, strictly speaking, a fighter, air superiority fighter, or interceptor. It was not a ground attacker at all. This is why, while the Marines looked at it, they decided not to adopt the F-14, because it had no ground attack capability, couldn't really deliver bombs initially. It was, strictly speaking, set up for the Sidewinder, Sparrow, and Phoenix missile. So yeah, this began replacing the F-4 throughout the fleet in the 1970s. And in 1981, when the RA-5C was retired, it also took over its reconnaissance duties. It really didn't see a whole lot of combat. It was mostly used for CAP, Combat Air Patrol, throughout the Navy in the 80s. Stationed here and there. But it was more of a deterrent than anything, because it was a very specific craft. It was meant to do a role, and that's what it did. It's worth pointing out that while it could carry quite a few missiles, it often was just kitted out with one Phoenix and a couple of Sparrows and a couple of Sidewinders, plus some drop tanks. That's kind of how I have mine set up here. Finally, in 1987, the old aardvark engine was replaced. They continued to have issues with it. It would stall out. They had several accidents. It was hard to get it off the carrier. They essentially had to use afterburner to get it launched when it was loaded up. Even then, it limited the fuel and armament. Finally, though, they replaced it with a more powerful engine, and this became initially the F-14A+, but quickly it was named the F-14B. And from there, it would go on to be used quite successfully in the Gulf War, 1990, 1991, in that time period. It's also around this time that the F-14D Super Tomcat came in, and this again improved the engines, but more importantly, it had updated avionics. It had what's called the glass cockpit, many other important changes to the internals, kind of updating it and modernizing it. And also a short time later in that same period, it was finally kind of reworked to be able to deliver laser-guided bombs like JDAMs. This was because the Navy was retiring the A-6 Intruder and needed an attack-capable plane. And also at the end of the Cold War, the S-14's purpose was kind of diminished a bit. So they reworked it with new systems, including a lantern pod, and gave it the attack capability that the Marines had wanted 20 years earlier. Production would officially end in 1991 with 712 built, most of the A variant, but then again there was the D, and several of the older planes were updated over time. Really, though, the plane changed very little from beginning to end, which is a testament to its airframe and Grumman's forethought. When America went into Afghanistan in 2001, the new attack capability was utilized. It led strikes into the country. It also provided strike escort, fighter escort, and it continued to be used during the Second Gulf War, 2003. But by this point, newer planes such as the FA-18 were online, and the cost of maintaining and operating such a big bird was getting a bit much. So it was decided to retire the F-14, much to many's dismay, frankly. It was a very popular airplane because of a certain movie. I can't remember the name of it, from the 80s, but it was very popular because of that. It ceased carrier operations in July of 2006. And then in September of that year, it was given a very big farewell by the Navy. Now, interestingly, in 2007, after the planes were taken out of service, it was decided to chop up the remaining F-14s because Iran was one of the few foreign operators of this plane. At the time, in the 70s, when it adopted it, the Shah was still in power and they were an ally. But then, of course, the revolutionaries came through in 79 and acquired the F-14s and continue to fly them, well, they do to this very day, really, although they've cut back a lot in the last few years. And America was worried that they would get their hands on parts and things from retired American F-14s to keep theirs flying, so they cut the remaining fleet up. And the last one was sent to the boneyard in 2009, thus ending quite a distinguished career. And you might see back here my F5 Tiger. This is actually a model from Hobbymaster of the Navy Aggressor used as training at the Top Gun school the Navy ran. So this would have been used in practice missions against the F-14. It would be representing a MiG in war games against this. It was also in that movie. I can't remember its name. I just slipping my mind. But it was used as the MiG, the fictitious MiG-28 in that film. So I decided I'd bring it out. It's really interesting to see such a big plane here and just how small the F-5 is here. Again, these are both to scale. They're both 172 die-cast. I actually really like this little F-5. In a lot of the ways, it's very different from most American planes. As far as this Hobbymaster F-14, I like it too. It's very heavy, very metal. The wings are metal, they're not plastic. I love how they fold in and out, but it's very smooth. They almost glide. They have enough resistance. They're not floppy, but they're not so hard that they're difficult. And they are geared together, so if you move one, they both move to keep them in synchronous. It does have opening canopy, of course, with the two pilots, and it actually comes with a good deal of ordnance, so you can kind of set it up a few different ways. A lot of companies make the F-14. Century and Caliber both come to mind, but pretty much everyone's made an F-14, so it's a little bit vanilla, kind of like the P-51. I might get eventually like an F-14D from someone else just for comparison, but the truth is there's just not a lot of difference between the versions of this plane, so kind of hard to justify getting another one when it's going to look almost identical. But maybe one day I'll find a good deal and pick up a second one, trying to get a Super Tomcat for the fleet. But yeah, this is a relatively new tooling they've done, so I encourage you to check them out. They are a little cheaper than a Century or a Caliber, and I think the quality, it's a very nice, heavy model, very durable. Comes with a metal stem on the stand and the wide base, which is good because again it's a very wide plane. And no Navy fighter collection would be complete without a Tomcat. So there you have it, guys. Not exactly a whole lot of history, because while this was made with lessons learned in Vietnam, it was really too late to serve in that, and it wasn't exactly the right plane for the first Gulf War. But nevertheless, it was iconic for the Navy. And it was not something forced upon them by the politicians. It was very much a Navy and very much a Grumman plane designed for a very specific purpose, one that it fulfilled very admirably despite less than perfect engines in it for the first decade or so of operation. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this Cat Wings. It's been a lot of fun to make, a little kind of tongue-in-cheeky. Got one more episode at the end here, kind of maybe a bit of a off-the-cuff surprise. Any questions or comments, please do post them below. And if you could, like, share, and subscribe. Well, this is Misha, and I will catch you very soon next time. Now requesting permission to buzz the tower.